Hi, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Allen. I'm a weekend anchor and reporter at Denver 7. Welcome to the Volunteers of America HCA Healthcare Foundation Speakers Series. This is the second event in our panel series exploring moral distress and moral injury among first responders and the solutions available to help manage the challenging experiences they face. Our first responders here in Colorado and around the country are being pushed to their limits. We're coming off a pandemic, crime is on the rise, resignations are up, retention is down, and staff shortages are the new norm. The headlines from city to city reveal there is a real struggle among the first responder community. We learned in our first panel series that all this stress and pressure can build up and weigh down a person to the point of feeling out of control of their situation, that it has a name, moral distress. And when left unchecked, it can affect how someone does their job, taking away their confidence and chipping away at their resilience. The sober reality is that 30% of first responders develop behavioral conditions as compared to just 20% of the general population. This is a result of that occupational stress that comes along with doing their job to serve and protect our communities when we need them. That's why today's discussion will focus on the solutions and the resources available to our first responders, from what's available, the proven strategies, and how we can reach those who need support. Now, we have an incredible group of panelists here with us today. I'm going to tell you all of their names and what they do. First of all, Chief Mark Novak. He is the Vail Fire and Emergency Services Chief. Holly Seeley, President and CEO of the North Suburban Medical Center and Air Life Denver. Kasia Laskowski, Executive Director of Thrive Global Foundation and leader of their hashtag First Responders First initiative. Reverend Dr. Sharon Ellis Davis, PhD, a former Chicago police officer, now of the McCormick Theological Seminary and Lexington Theological Seminary. James Wong, a VOA ReST facilitator, trainer, and a former ReST participant. And also Dr. Rita Brock. She's the director of the Shea Moral Injury Center at Volunteers of America. Thank you so much for joining us today, all of you. We have so much experience and knowledge here among our panelists, so we want to jump right in. I'll start with Dr. Brock. Dr. Brock, I'd like to begin with you to briefly set the stage for our audience, since moral distress is not a term that most people are familiar with. I wasn't before I started looking into this, but the way you described it in the first panel series really resonates. I think it makes it crystal clear. You describe it as something that can't be fixed by a vacation or sleep, that is something that continues to bother you until you deal with it. So before we get into the solutions and strategies to manage moral distress, could you expand a little bit on what causes it and why simply taking a break doesn't fix it?
Right. So first, I want to say that it is not a mental health disorder. And I think it's important to say that because it's an ordinary human experience. All of us have moral conflicts. We do something wrong, somebody else does something wrong. We have to apologize or they apologize. And we, sort of negotiate these moral conflicts all the time. But sometimes we hit a situation where it can't be fixed, where the harm might be permanent, or we might not be clear about how to fix it, or we have conditions in our life that makes it impossible to fix it. And I think a pandemic counts as that kind of a condition. And so then it can bother you. Like it isn't fixable, so it can haunt you. You can lose sleep. You maybe have several things like that happen that burden you, and you're not your best self at work or with your family. You're just not your best self. And if that accumulates, if you just keep having things like that pile up and pile up, or something catastrophically huge happens all at once, you can actually break. you can actually just start to doubt yourself and wonder if you're a good person. You can feel so much shame or guilt or outrage or intense moral feelings that you don't want to be with anyone. You may start drinking to numb that pain, or use drugs, or overwork and just keep working frantically so you don't have to think about the moral dilemmas and distress that you're in. And you can get to the point where you suffer enough that you might not want to stay alive. It can be that serious. So it needs to be dealt with, but a lot of mental health professionals are not very familiar with moral distress and moral injury. And so we created ReST so that there would be a way for people to be with others who are also sharing and help each other through it.
It's something serious that people need to be aware of, but it's not on a lot of people's radar. So thank you so much for shining a light.
And there's no diagnosis or protocol. It's not a disorder. It's actually an appropriate response to terrible conditions, right? If we're not suffering, maybe there's something wrong with us. Because when something's really wrong with the world, it generally bothers moral people.
We should be suffering if we're going through these experiences. We just have to know how to deal with it correctly.
Yeah, we need to have ways to alleviate the suffering, because the things don't just, if you think differently, it's not like that didn't happen to you. It still happened to you. So you have to learn to accept it and come to terms with it. And the only way you can do that is to get rid of the pain that's sitting there that makes you want to avoid going there. What I say is, when you're in that much pain, it means that the good part of you is really fighting and wanting out. And if you don't deal with the pain, the good, you won't ever get to that part of yourself that's the good person that you lost track of.
Wow. Thank you so much for explaining that so clearly, Dr. Brock. I want to bring in Holly. Holly, you have seen it all. I'm going to give people a little background on you. Nearly 20 years experience in emergency and trauma services as a flight nurse and first responder. Now you lead a large trauma 2 hospital center here in Colorado, and your 3 decades of healthcare experience span the globe. So what can you tell us about this moment in time and why supporting first responders, which includes emergency room staff, is so critical right now?
Thank you, Dr. Brock, for actually bringing up the topic and saying sometimes if we act like we're not feeling anything, that's not right either. So I've not heard a lot of people say that. And yes, I've been there and done a lot. And if you think about stress, is our body's response to pressure and feeling out of control. And that's what first responders do every day. And so recognizing that building pressure is important. If you think about the past few years with the pandemic, and everyone is feeling more stressed and more pressure, and the first responders, right? They were the first line of defense. When there was all the unknowns of the pandemic, they were going into homes where they didn't know what they were going to see. They were dealing with things that no one has done in years about, whether we had the protective equipment that was right, whether people were using it and they were exposing themselves. So if you take the normal pressures of being a first responder, you add on the pandemic pressures, it's at an all-time need for us to take care of those people that have been taking care of us for years. And I'm glad we've finally been highlighted for the good work that we do. And thanks a lot for bringing me into the discussion.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Holly, for being here. I want to bring in Chief Novak. Chief, when there's an emergency, we all count on the fact that someone will be there to respond to our call for help, but we often do not think about the struggles that our first responders go through. So let me ask you, how is your department faring and how are you helping to support their well-being?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question, Jacqueline. Certainly, the points are really spot on. First responders, what a lot of people don't recognize is they're people too. And, they see us in big shiny trucks and, wearing special gear, and they think that somehow we're somehow immune to the normal stressors that people face, and even some of the stressors that can be caused internally with some of the decisions we have to make. So I think that's probably the first thing to remember is that, we're all regular people. We have families. Different things impact each one of us really differently. As far as understanding how it's impacting our organization, that's really been, in our employees, really been a tough question over the last several years, because often, we don't know that somebody's facing moral distress or having a challenging time until they really do hit kind of that point that that Dr. Brock spoke of, where they're not coping well anymore. And so really what we want to focus on, which is really what this whole discussion about, is, you know, how do we engage the preventative actions more fully, and how do we get people engaged in those things ahead of time? And so most fire departments in Colorado and really around the US, we have programs such as peer support, which is a very effective program. Often people just need to talk to somebody and maybe just kind of download and decompress a little bit. So we found that to be very effective. We also have traditional EAP programs. Really important with those that we have not only just EAP programs, but people within those programs that are culturally competent, that understand what the stressors are that first responders face.
Yeah, I think all of that is so important. And I mean, the bottom line is first responders, as you said, we are real people. We are regular people. We're going through what real people go through when we deal with this. So I want to ask both you and Holly as well. You know, we keep hearing that there is a shortage of first responders all across the country, to the point it's at a crisis level in some places. I actually saw a study that 69% of EMT providers report not having enough recovery time between traumatic events. So I think it's important in the current situation that first responder organizations offer some programs, like, as you mentioned, the EAP program or ReST, or something that can help manage on the job stress. Have you seen that as well?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take that one first. Yes, I think programs like this are vital. And I think people actually having the courage to speak up and know that they need help are important. But some things we're doing here, I also, in my other role, get to manage Air Life Denver, and it's our air ambulance company here. And we've enlisted things on the day-to-day, something as simple as a timeout procedure. And that is when a crew feels either exhausted because of the call volume, overwhelmed because of the criticality of the call, or just any reason during that shift, they need to say, time out, give me a pause, I need to take a rest. And we allow them to do that without asking them why. Now, one thing to note, we also track that, and it's not so we can ask, go back and say, well, you didn't work your full shift. We track it to see if there are trends and if people are calling timeouts more often, so we can approach them and ask how they're doing, and if there's things that we can do to help them be ready for the role. But I think things like that are really important. And then another thing we do at Air Life Denver is we actually annually do a safety stand down day. We take a majority of the crews off shift. We're lucky to do that because we have partners in the city that can help us provide care. And we have everyone stop and we get together as a team. We bring in outside speakers on the topics such as safety, mental health and well-being, teamwork, and we just rejuvenate ourselves for the next year. So I think those are some things that aren't formal, but that we're doing that I think really make us stand out as a company.
So
Mark,
if I could, Jacqueline, just tag on to what Holly said. Yeah, those are great initiatives, and we're doing a lot of really similar things, both within Vail Fire and across the fire service. In June of every year, we have a national firefighter safety stand down, and several of the last years we've really focused on behavioral health. The other thing that I think is really important is to kind of understand this concept that there's not a solution. There's not one thing that's going to be effective for every single person. Some people may want to talk with a peer. Some people may want to talk with somebody who's been formally trained. So we have to really be adaptive and meet people where they're at. When we look at a broader landscape, I spoke about peer support and EAP programs. Within Colorado, this last legislative session, the legislator established a firefighter behavioral health trust, which appropriated $1 million for the initial year for this health trust. To make sure that every firefighter in the state has access to behavioral health resources, such as EAP and peer support. And this is especially important for volunteer firefighters who may not have access to traditional resources that paid firefighters or people in hospitals or more rigid or formal organizations may have. And then we're also currently working with the Colorado State Fire Chiefs to create a peer network for fire chiefs. And one of the things that we sometimes fail to acknowledge is that we put a lot of effort into supporting the folks that are out there on the front lines doing the job. But the leaders of organizations, and I'm looking at the screen at Holly, we sometimes carry the cumulative stress of all the employees. We hear about the traumas and the challenges that they're all facing. And so we're creating a peer support network solely for fire chiefs because they need somebody who understands what they deal with on a daily basis. And I would, I'd actually be interested to know if, hospitals have engaged in that same type of interaction, because I think there's a lot of benefit there. So there, again, probably the biggest thing is we need to understand that, as you hit on earlier, prevention is incredibly important. We want to make sure that we, reach people where they need the help before there's destructive or unhealthy behaviors, but also understand that it's not the same for every person. Each person has different avenues that are going to be effective for them.
Jacqueline, you're on mute.
I apologize. I want to bring in Kasha here with the Thrive Global Foundation. She's devoted to ending what, Kasha, you call the burnout epidemic, but more specifically, you lead the hashtag First Responders First initiative. So could you take a moment, tell us about your program, and also what are some of the strategies you are using to support the first responder community where we're hearing and reading about burnout at these record levels?
Yes, thank you so much, Jacqueline, and thank you to Volunteers of America for inviting me to join this conversation, and really to all of the first responders who are joining us as panelists and also those who are joining us as participants in this webinar. As you mentioned, Jacqueline, I'm the Executive Director of the Thrive Global Foundation, which is the philanthropic arm of Thrive Global, the behavior change technology company founded by Arianna Huffington to end the stress and burnout epidemic around the world. But I really come to this conversation through our initiative, First Responders First, which was launched in partnership with Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Creative Artists Agency in March 2020, right as the pandemic began to disrupt lives as we knew it. First Responders First was really founded with the mission to care for our caregivers, and it takes a whole human approach to first responder and healthcare worker well-being. You ask about some of the strategies, and our strategies to support the first responder community first started with providing tangible provisions and protections to this workforce, some of which Holly mentioned earlier, those needs, but it included PPE, childcare, accommodations, and meals. And then it really expanded to include funding direct mental health resources and services to healthcare workers. What we realized in our deployment of these mental health resources and services was, even though the need was clearly there, I'm sure it's not a surprise to many of those on this call, the uptake and engagement was very low. Even if these resources were free, if they were provided outside of traditional health insurance providers. So we at First Responders First took a step back and really started to look at some of the systemic barriers that exist within the healthcare space. Like so many of those that have been talked about today, and even on the first installment of this webinar, whether it be stigma or fear of career ramifications, we realized that we needed to approach our work from both ends. So yes, providing the solutions, but also at the same time, working to identify and eliminate mental health and well-being challenges that disadvantage our healthcare workers in the first place. So in partnership with the Dr. Lorna Breen Heroes Foundation, which was represented on the first edition of this webinar series by our partner, Corey Feist, First Responders First launched the All-In Wellbeing First for Healthcare initiative, a coalition of leading healthcare organizations that are really committed to this dual approach of, yes, advancing solutions, but also eliminating systemic challenges. So some of the strategies, we mentioned a few earlier in terms of different things that people do at the local level, and Holly and Chief Novak also mentioned them, but we really accomplish our goals by first, of course, listening and then taking action. One of the ways that we have found really our superpower in is by funding and investing in solutions at the healthcare level. So really relying on those closest to the problem. So for us, first responders and healthcare workers, to tell us what the solutions are, and then us providing those financial resources to help them bring these ideas to life. By the end of 2022, All in will have provided $1 million in grant funding to healthcare organizations to implement those solutions, and another $250,000 to nurse-led innovations through our first ever Nurse Hack for Health Pitchathon. And simultaneously, we're also working to eliminate those systemic barriers that prevent healthcare workers from seeking help. So before I sort of pass it on, I just wanted to take a minute to mention that, the fact is that most clinicians, most healthcare workers aren't seeking mental health care right now, despite high rates of burnout and high rates of stress, due to their fear of losing their license and credentials. That is a fact, and that's been shown in surveys since before the pandemic, but especially now the pandemic. A lot of people think it's for different reasons, but this has proven to be one of the top reasons. So we're working to change that by collaborating with licensure boards, hospitals, health systems to review and change overly broad and invasive mental health questions so that we actually eliminate these questions on the licensure and credentialing applications that perhaps could prevent healthcare workers from seeking care. So those are two of the main strategies that we have right now that we're really looking to take action with.
You guys are doing amazing work, and it's so interesting because what you are speaking to actually speaks to a question that we just got in, and I think I'll actually ask this one of Chief Novak again. We had a viewer who asked, how have you encountered or combated lingering stigmas around asking for help or seeking counseling, which is exactly what we were just hearing about from Kasha. This is an ongoing issue. What have you seen, and how do you try to deal with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's really the core of what we're trying to achieve, right? And so again, there's a number of approaches we use. Probably the biggest thing that we're trying to do to combat that is we're trying to normalize this idea that we need to talk about things that we're exposed to. We need to seek help when we're not processing stressors well. And then the other part of that, besides just normalizing it and making it part of everyday business, and having sessions where we're talking about it through safety stand downs. I feel obligated also to lead by example in that regard. And that's part of the reason we're working on this peer support group for fire chiefs, so that I can say, maybe not talk about specifics, but say, hey, I was talking with my peer group the other day, we're talking about these challenging issues, and it was really helpful for me because, and then you fill in the blank. But letting people see that, it's not just leadership of organizations saying, hey, you guys really should take care of yourself and take advantage of these resources, but also us as leaders saying, this is important at every level of our organization. We're participating in it too. Maybe we're not always participating at the same level as the frontline workers, but people at every level need to be involved with taking care of themselves, developing coping mechanisms, becoming more resilient. Those are all things that we need to be doing.
Very well said. And I kind of hear a common theme here. You just talked about normalizing. We heard Dr. Brock saying this is a normal human experience and a normal human response, normalizing that this is okay and trying to remove that stigma. Thank you for that response. I want to pull in Sharon into this conversation and get your perspective. Not only did you serve as a Chicago police officer for many years, you were also a police chaplain there, serving your colleagues as a source of trust and strength. So having experienced both sides, can you tell us, why does a program like this work to alleviate moral distress? And, in your experience, helping those who have experienced moral distress, what works in those situations?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to participate in this panel. And I can answer both of those questions as I look at what we do, or what I did as a chaplain, what we do in general as chaplains with the Chicago Police Department. We are the full-time police officers are full-time chaplains also. And so we serve in both capacities, but not at the same time. But both of them are areas where we have the opportunity to informally and formally care for officers. Of course, we didn't call this moral distress, but that's exactly what the officers were going through. And so the advantage that we had as chaplains is that we had the legal access and the to officers in various spaces. various spaces as in roll calls, where they're preparing the work assignments to go out on the street. We have access to them within a street patrol, because we have cars also that can be out there. And we have access to them in so many areas where we have the ability to gain trust, to gain trusting and helpful relationships with one another informally. And the good news is that that provides an opportunity for us to build that trust before a crisis happens. And so at the time of any crises or that causes moral distress, and those can be police shootings, police officers who are killed in the line of duty. It could be suicide issues of your partners or people that you know within the department, or just know them and sense that we are all police officers together. When there's the ethical decisions that have to be made in times of police misconduct, and all of the issues that are happening impact police officers in ways that many people don't realize, because as someone said before, we do this work so habitually as chaplains that possibly we don't dig down even enough to understand what it is that officers really need in that time. But we do, what it does is it gives us that quick access in those times of crises and struggles. It gives us some bonding that's quicker than what normally you would have to do if someone else was there in distress. And it offers you that opportunity to do what you came there to do in a quick way. And that's care for the officers in whatever way that they need. And so those are wonderful. What makes the program here so much different is that there's more than officers what they need in terms of immediate response. Immediate response is wonderful. Getting someone through a crisis so that they can think better is wonderful, and being able to do that kind of work is important. But as it also, we don't have a department that's totally focused on moral distress. We have counselors, we have people in place, we have peer assignments, but these are not permanent things that we do with officers. We have a plethora of other work to do. We have special details that take chaplains away and bring them to other duties. And so what happens long term? What happens when the conversation is over? What happens to when people go about their own business? What happens to when they retire and they're really thinking about all the injuries that they were opposed upon? Where do they go? And this organization, for me, picks up, where the regular things that we do that are so important and necessary provides that space for healing, that space for helping us to. I'm an advocate of storytelling, and as a professor also, I just believe in storytelling as a means of healing, and active listening as a means of healing through empathetic responses. And so this organization provides that. It provides that for groups. It provides that with non-judgmental presence. It provides that with trained facilitators, that help them go through the process of how to work with people that are coming into this place. And so these are not people that are facilitating that don't have some kind of a procedural responses to what's going on. And many of them are recovering themselves or have recovered from moral injury, and they can speak to that. And so the ReST organization is everything, and people need to have access to it and join it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hear someone saying in the background, we need these programs. And I think it's so interesting to hear you talk about that, Sharon, about talking about building trust before a crisis. And we all know that a lot of times in the immediate aftermath of something terrible happening, there's a huge response. But what I hear you saying is that when we start to feel the cumulative effect down the road, long term, that's what we're talking about here. And I love the idea of storytelling as a means of healing. Us getting to tell our story can help us heal. So I wanted to ask you, I'm hearing about one study where 3/4 of police surveyed
from your command.
reported having experienced a traumatic event, but less than half of them had told their agency about it. Their agency had no idea. So what else can we be doing to try to reach and help those first responders who are suffering?
First, we have to reach them, right? And that's the difficult part. And then second, we have to convince them, that this is the place for them, and convince them that it's an environment in which they can get the help. And so I think when I think about how do we get to people, is that we begin to create ways to establish creative advertising. It's wonderful to have a website. It's wonderful to have all of these provisions, but how do we reach the people directly? What kind of creative solutions do we have for meeting people on a mass level where they're not reading us? They're actually hearing from us in various ways. I think that's a way that we can help people to understand who we are. In addition to that, establishing some kind of handbook that can be mass mail. We need grants that can be mass mail to individuals that we are really in contact with, and people that are in these groups, so they can really understand what this moral distress is. I am a trauma survivor, and I didn't know I had trauma. I just thought I was acting normally. And so when people are in moral distress, sometimes they're not going to recognize that's not me, that's them, but it's certainly not me. And so we have to really find a way to help them to get access to what this really is, what it means, in ways in which they can say, aha, I think I need some help. Let me make a phone call.
They need to have that aha moment. And so that way, because otherwise, it's possible, even not only that they are not letting their agencies know, but they don't even know themselves.
Yes.
So that brings me to James. I want to bring you in here now. James, as a ReST facilitator, running a peer group session, you have a front row seat to the strategies that we're talking about here, but you also have a special connection to ReST. You were first a participant. I thought this was so fascinating. I heard your story a while back. As a Vietnam veteran in the first iteration of the program, you said that in ReST, you found help for the first time, and that as a facilitator, you've heard many participants who say ReST provided help that years of therapy had not. Of course, that makes me ask, what is it about ReST that is different and so helpful?
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, and the panelists have been amazing. They've covered a lot of ground already, but let me just say this: what makes, I think, ReST different is its design, and let me explain what I mean by that. First, we facilitators are peers. This levels the playing field. Therapy is hierarchical in structure, so you get this thing going on, and I think this can be problematic. Secondly, we don't pathologize moral distress and moral injury. And by that, I mean, we don't see participants as sick or having something wrong with them. Dr. Rita already explained what in detail, but let me just say this. Sometimes there are things that are seen that we can't be unseen. There are things that can't be forgotten, even though we wish we could. And that's a result of having a conscience. And there's the disconnect. That's the first disconnect. So, and let me just make a point here, because I feel really strongly about it. And I'll re-emphasize some things that have already been said, but these are normal, healthy reactions, aren't weaknesses. They aren't failings, and they aren't some kinds of shortcomings. Humans having human emotions aren't defective. And so sadly, traditional therapy often defines what goes on inside of a person as a disorder. So that's another disconnect. Also worth noting, and I think this has already been mentioned too, but let me just say it maybe a little differently, that sometimes work environments and even society, there exists a culture where unrealistic expectations are placed upon first responders. You're expected to be superhuman or heroes. In other words, your humanness is taken away. You're simply not allowed to be just human. And so that's another disconnect. So let me wrap up by saying What I believe makes ReST so helpful is that we create a warm and inviting and a safe place. It's a place where participants can bring those experiences and difficult emotions and feelings, and participants are truly listened to and heard by peers who have been through similar situation and understand what it's like. We listen to each other with acceptance, empathy, compassion, and without judgment. And participants can share these experiences and things about themselves that they may not feel safe to share anywhere else. So in ReST, participants begin to heal their wounds. And look, make no mistake, these are wounds. And even though they're invisible, they're just as real and damaging as the physical wounds that rip flesh and bone apart. So we help each other. We gather our fragmented and broken parts and restore ourselves to a sense of wholeness and of worthiness.
Wow, and that is so powerful. And James, I want to hear your story a little bit about how you turned to ReST for support and how your experience kind of going through that program led you back to it in the a new role as your role now as a facilitator.
Well, thank you. I think what compels me is because I want for others what I want for myself. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if all of us could have a life that's purposeful, meaningful, fulfilling, and hopefully filled with love, beauty, and joy, and a life as free from strife as possible. So moral distress and moral injury interfere with those things. If I can help others on their journey towards these values that I believe we all hold in our hearts, how can I refuse? How can I not? I believe that ReST and the work we do benefits others in the same way it helped me. As a result of my time in Vietnam War and my inability to process moral distress, I suffered for decades with moral injury. Of course, I didn't know what that was. I didn't know then. I flip-flopped back and forth between trying to escape the pain that I was carrying by being addicted to excitement. That's adrenaline, right? And excessive time at work, like Dr. Rita mentioned. And then that was followed by long bouts of depression, which sometimes is defined as anger turned inward. So today, I'm grateful for all that have gone before me, that have done all this work and shown light on my path. And I feel a great sense of duty to do the same for others, to give back, give away, pay forward, however you want to describe it, but that which was freely given to me. And let me just add, what a great honor and privilege it is to humbly and truly, finally be of service. I get to bear witness to the growth and healing of others. I get to celebrate and applaud our participants as they recover the beauty, strength, and demonstrate the resilience of human spirit.
That is so beautiful. I thank you so much for sharing such a personal story and for continuing to serve in the way that you are serving. That is just wonderful. Now we've got a few follow-up questions that are coming in, both from viewers and that I have as well. I want to ask Reverend Davis, this is from one of our viewers, how do you maintain full confidentiality as a chaplain? This viewer said, I have noticed in our agency where I am chaplain that there are that the more connections there are with command, the less trust there is. Moral injury does not get fully disclosed because there is fear that it will be taken to command staff. How do you respond to that?
I can respond to that by saying yes. I am a police officer, and with that job, we have jobs to do. But in the capacity of chaplain, we have certain privileges around confidentiality that command staff cannot overrule that. And also we as caregivers, we don't keep notes like professional people do. We don't have notes, and so there's nothing for someone to even subpoena. And at the same time, when we're taking care of officers, we will upfront, or at least I know I will upfront say what the limits of my confidentiality could be, and then they choose how to talk to me based on how I talk about confidentiality. But it's never been an issue. The only issue we have with command staff, if they're bossy, that's the that comes with the beast, and they like to assign you to things and make sure that you're on your job. But other than that, it's a wonderful place to be, to help officers and to be there with them in their times of distress, and to be able to have built that relationship with them early on, that they do trust us. Not with everything. That's why we need places like ReST, because there's not enough time to do all of that, because we have other assignments also.
Thank you for responding to that. I have a question here for Kasha and Rita from a viewer that I think is really interesting, because I know so many people who are family members of first responders. The viewer asked, do any of these programs have components that address and support first responder family members?
Well, let me start by saying we have several versions of ReST. So the first responder one is a separate one, but we have what we call regular ReST, rather than a special one. And in regular ReST, anyone can come. And so we do get families of people who work in medicine or in first responder work, or military families. We get family members that come and share there also. And what we found in the regular ReST is often we'll have a group with people who are quite diverse, but somehow the feelings are similar. And so they really connect around empathy for each other, even if they may not be in the same space or even the same age or whatever. And so we've had students, we've had seniors, we've had spouses in situations where their partner was in a difficult position and they felt sort of left out, or that they were worried about the person. So that we do have resources that are open to the general public as well. And in that branch of ReST, there's also a Monday veterans group. So we do have a special one for veterans as well. But the one for first responders is really for first responders. And we know that there's the kinds of stresses that first responders do are really high stakes. And that not everybody's job is like that. We may have life conditions that are high stakes, but we don't have to go to work every day with those kind of high stakes.
It's a whole different ballgame. That's true. Thank you, Dr. Brock. Kasha, would you care to weigh in on that? Family members, support for family members of first responders.
I would just echo Dr. Nakashima Brock's, provision of the ReST program, because I know that there's a lot of different facets of that can be helpful for family members, but also in our work too, part of I think the struggle with family members is the feeling of helplessness and not knowing where to turn, not knowing where to go. And so part of what we try to do at First Responders First and All in Wellbeing First for Healthcare is give the general public and family members ways to take action, whether that is joining us in our efforts to destigmatize the conversations around asking for help, or providing conversation guides around how to have these conversations. One other program I do want to mention is the Brave of Heart Fund, which I do know provides resources to family members of healthcare workers. So there are many different programs that are happening locally, but I think the piece that we really add value to is really providing different ways for family members to take action in support of their loved ones, and just creating and starting these conversations.
I have just one other thing to add to.
Go ahead, please.
That sometimes people in high stakes work have things that happen that are really horrifying, just really devastatingly horrifying. And I've had people say to me, I don't want to talk to my family about this. I don't want this in their head. It's bad enough that it's in my head. And so if you're a family member and the person is reluctant to talk to you, you just need to make sure they have somebody they can talk to. Of course, ReST is one place they could go with that. But I do think that we have to respect that sometimes people want to protect their families from some of the things that happen to them, because it's just too much.
I didn't even think about that, but of course they want to protect the people they love from the horrors that they may have going through their mind, but that doesn't mean that they can't talk to someone about it, other people who've been through the same thing or facilitators who can help them explore that. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I want to get a follow-up question based on a lot of the things that you all have been saying. I'll start with Sharon, Mark, and Kasha. So the question that we're kind of hearing from a lot of people is, how do we get those who need programs like ReST to take advantage of them? Sharon, do you want to start first?
I can, because it's probably short. I said it earlier that I really believe we need to have multiple ways to reach officers and those that are involved with moral injury and distress. We need better ways to reach them, to give them the information that if they knew better, they would probably do better in terms of reaching out. But we have to get to that. We have to get to their minds. We have to get to their hearts and let them know that not only is this something that we all go through, but it's something that specifically can affect first responders. And it would be helpful for you to come in and at least try it out once.
I like that. If they knew better, they would do better. And you said earlier, creative advertising. I think that's so true. Chief Novak, how do we get people to take advantage of these programs?
Yeah, that is a really important question, and thank you for that. I think one of the things we talked earlier about normalization, and one of the models that I've seen effective in some peer groups is that people don't check in with the peer group when they're experiencing stressors or moral distress. They do it on a routine basis. So maybe there's a Zoom meeting that's every month, or whatever time schedule like ReST, and you get people to be in the habit of checking in with that group every month, whatever the time frame is. And then when they have these issues or stressors, they're already in the habit of contacting that group and feeling comfortable talking with them. It's not this, wow, something's really bothering me, I need to reach out to somebody. It's just become part of how they process life and how they process their job.
That is a great idea. And I want to bring you in, Kasha, because earlier you talked about, even though people need these programs, uptake is low, and that basically the idea is that we need to identify solutions and eliminate challenges. So I want to ask you, how do we do that to get people to take advantage of programs like this? How do we eliminate the challenges?
Well, I cannot say it more beautifully than Reverend Ellis Davis said it, which was, first we need to reach people and then we need to convince them. And that is what we're trying to do with first responders first. Part of what we've been working on is first and foremost convening. So right now, our All in Wellbeing First for Healthcare Coalition represents over 1 million healthcare voices across our nation. And the other part, which has been very core to first responders' work since the very beginning, and it's another thing that Reverend Ellis Davis mentioned, is storytelling. We've used storytelling as a way to normalize and destigmatize the conversation since the very beginning. We're very proud to announce that today launched the newest project, Voices from the Front Lines, which will feature some of the healthcare worker stories on Lemonada's podcast, including burnout. And our first healthcare worker story is available now, and we'll continue to roll out these stories. But part of it is just helping healthcare workers and first responders realize that they are not alone in their struggles. And sometimes that reminder needs to come from the top, from the leadership, from those people who you least expect it, to really share their vulnerability. I know James mentioned it earlier, but to show that accessing mental health resources, taking care of yourself is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign of strength. And so the more that we put out that messaging and change the culture at the systems level, the more healthcare workers and first responders will feel comfortable availing them of these services.
Thank you so much, Kasha. You said that very well too. I want to bring in both Holly and I want to bring in Holly. We just heard from Chief Novak. Thank you for that. You, Holly, you see doctors, nurses, EMT, both fire and police enter your hospital too. So how do you reach those? Is there a special way to engage with the people that you're trying to reach?
Let me first actually talk just for a second about what James said that I think is really important. This program is a peer-led. And you guys also mentioned the struggle with families. I remember years ago as a flight nurse, in a 3-hour time span, I went from preparing for a dinner party to being on the side of a highway, putting a breathing tube down someone, cutting their chest open, delivering them to an OR, and then talking to a mother and a son about the possibility of this person not making it, to going back to a dinner party. 3-hour span. So I walk in the door. What is my answer when they said, oh, where were you? Why are you late? Oh, how was your day? So I just want to reiterate how important it is. Yes, we want to protect our families. We need to talk to our peers. It's really hard to describe what we go through. It's hard for people to understand. So thank you guys so much for bringing that up. I think that's a key component. In traditional therapy, it doesn't do it. I promise, I've tried it. But going back to your original question, I think, what Kasha said, leading with vulnerability, sharing stories. We had a mass casualty incident a couple weekends ago, and within 24 hours, I was on site with other senior leaders walking around. And here's a key thing I think that I did in the past that I've changed. I'm not asking people anymore, how are you doing? Or are you okay? I'm saying, let's talk. Mm-hmm. And then they can decide, do they want to talk about the incident? Do they want to talk about the Broncos loss? I mean, no one wants to talk about that anymore, but I'm opening the door for a conversation. But, we take care of people, we save lives, and we're always okay. So if that's the question, that's the answer you're going to get. So I've changed the question from a question to a statement, said, let's talk and let's sit down. And then the conversation will lead where it needs to be for that day. And then I'm able to share my stories. And I think that being very proactive and being out there and being vulnerable and being willing to listen are key components.
Wow, Holly, I mean, thank you so much for sharing that story. I don't know about everyone else, but it gave me goosebumps, and it really gave some insight into what first responders have to kind of go through and deal with. And I love the idea of don't say, how are you doing? Say, let's talk. And that brings it up very directly. I want to come full circle here and go back to Dr. Brock and ask you one last question. Dr. Brock, you helped create the ReST program. You've seen its development through the years. So I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, how transformative has this been for the people who have taken advantage of it?
Well, I can start with, we did it first with veterans in a in-person longer program. That's where I met Jim. And I 2 years after one of the veterans, I can say this because she gave me permission to say this, that she had so much trauma in her childhood from sexual abuse and a neglectful mother, that for her, the military was like stability. Like, she entered the military for a better life. And then she was raped in the military, and then she was on drugs, and she went to prison, and she had a 6-year-old son and lost custody of her son. And when she came out of prison, she tried to turn her life around. And so when we had her in our group, she had been recently homeless with a 6-year-old son. And so she was in affordable housing that VOA provides for veterans. And so she went through the program, and she was so stressed about the trauma that had to be unloaded that sometimes she would be physically unwell. And so our administrator, who's a clinician, just kept saying, if you don't feel well, just go lie down in your room and you can come back when you feel better. And she kept coming back. And to her credit, she didn't give up and went through the program. And 2 years later, I saw her 20-year-old son, the original one she'd lost custody of, that was living with her, plus the now 8-year-old son that she was taking care of. And the 20-year-old pulled me aside from this reunion we were having for some of the people who went through the program. And he said, I realize this thing is for veterans, but you need to know it's also for the families, because when my mom came back from your program, she was so different. She stopped being mean to us, and she listened to us, and she was really nice. And he said, I think it saved our family. Because I think when people carry that trauma pain and all those other things, it's hard for them to listen to others, and they're often angry about things, and so they're angry out of control sometimes, and just unloading those feelings can make a huge difference. And even in an hour, this is what I've learned from Jim and the other facilitators. I mean, I'm not in the groups, I don't know what happens, but 82% of participants have said they felt a lot less stressed out and felt much more calm after just 1 hour. And amazing things seem to happen. People actually do feel safe enough to share something really, really difficult. I have facilitated a few groups, and just because I wanted to see how it was like. And I've had people just sobbing and hardly able to speak. But then they came back so that I thought, okay, they found it helpful enough to return. I didn't facilitate the second time, but so it's partly what people give to it when they come, but it's also partly what they receive from the group itself that seems to be transformative for them. And I did want to say one thing I saw in a question, that because I think it needs a little bit clarity. Moral injury is you can have moral injury, trauma, and PTSD all at the same time, but they're not the same thing. So trauma is great harm that comes to you, and you may be, and there are horrible feelings that come with trauma. And you may even get PTSD from trauma. If you're terrified, your fear center may go into overdrive. That's all PTSD is that your fear can't calm down. So your memory's not very good. And you may have flashbacks or nightmares and have a hard time sleeping and all of those sorts of things. And there are actually good therapies for PTSD. They really can help people manage the symptoms of PTSD. So I think there is a role for mental health professionals in all of this. I don't want to disparage mental health because I think sometimes it's the best solution for something. But moral injury is not fear feelings, and it's not necessarily you have trauma. I know a policeman who came upon an accident and a person was trapped in a car and the car was on fire. And the person said, please shoot me, because they knew they were gonna, and he couldn't get them out. He didn't have the equipment. And he had to watch the person burn. He quit his job. He couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand that he wasn't allowed to use his service weapon as a mercy killing. And he felt so terrible. Well, he didn't have the trauma himself, and he wasn't terrified. But he had moral injury. He felt terrible morally that, it was just, he couldn't resolve it. And when he was telling the story, he'd never talked to anybody about it. He was crying. It was that deep a wound in him.
I would imagine so. That is horrifying. And it also, I think, paints a real picture of the kind of moral distress that our first responders have to deal with and come to terms with. And
he wouldn't probably have been sent for therapy for a critical incident because it was a traffic accident, and then he came on the aftermath of it.
Wow.
So even the systems that are in place, that when somebody's in a shooting or a terrible incident, that they really are required to go to a mental health specialist, I think those are good things, because you really do need to process, but sometimes people don't fall into those slots.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Brock, for that. I really appreciate it. And I want to respect everyone's time. So I want to say right now, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for your incredible insight. We look forward to continuing this conversation in our next panel that's happening this spring, and the date will soon be announced. So please share what you've learned today with others. If you know of someone who could benefit from VOA ReST, or if you could yourself, we invite you to register at ReST4, that's the number 4, firstresponders.com. So ReST4, firstresponders.com. You can register there. Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this. I love the first responder community. We need you. We rely on you. We appreciate all that you do. Thank you so much for doing this. Goodbye, everyone.